René Guénon, in his book Symbols of Sacred Science, writes, "The people thus persevere in their folklore, without understanding them, the debris of ancient traditions sometimes even reaching back to a past too remote to be determined. In so doing, they function as more or less, in quotes, subconscious, collective memory, the content of which has manifestly come from somewhere else. The things, so conserved, are found to contain in a more or less veiled form a considerable body of esoteric data." End quotes. J. Maxwell, in Le Tarot is le symbole, les arcanes, la divination, is the first author to have gone back to the tarot's origins, recognizing that the Tarot of Marseille, the one by Nicolas Convert, is an optical language and needs to be looked at in order to be understood. Later, Paul Marteau, in his book Le Tarot de Marseille, in imitation of Maxwell, reproduced the cards, analyzed them one by one, detail by detail, taking into consideration their number, the meaning of each color, and that of each gesture of the figures. However, although he pursued the truth path of tarot study inaugurated by Maxwell, he made two mistakes. On one hand, the deck he uses is only one variation of the original. His drawings are exact copies of the Tarot of Besançon, published by Grimaud at the end of the 19th century. Grimaud was only reproducing another Tarot of Besançon, published by Lecroix and signed Amoult 1748. That's Amoult, Amoult 1748. Marteau also permitted himself to alter certain details, as this made it possible for him to commercialize the deck and receive royalties from it as the author. On the other hand, he kept the four basic colors imposed by the printing machines, instead of respecting the old and more varied colors of the hand-painted decks. Unable to find any tarot closer to the authentic one than that of Paul Marteau, I devoted myself to it reverently. I realized that if anyone could teach me how to decipher it, it would not be a teacher of flesh and blood, but the tarot itself. Everything I wanted to know was right there, between my hands and before my eyes, in the cards. It was essential to stop listening to the explanations founded on the tradition, the concordances, the myths, the parapsychological explanations, and allow the arcana to speak for themselves. To integrate the tarot into my life beyond memorizing it, I performed actions with it that rational minds would probably consider childish. For example, I slept every night with a different card under my pillow or spent an entire day with one of them in my pocket. I rubbed my body with the cards. I spoke in their names, imagining the rhyme and tone of each of their voices. I visualized each figure naked, imagined its symbols covering the sky, completed the drawings that disappeared in the frame. I gave full bodies to the animal that accompanies the fool and to the Pope's occultus, extended the magician's table until its invisible fourth leg was revealed, imagined from where the veil of the high priestess hung, saw toward what ocean flowed the stream that nourished the woman of the star, and where the pool and the moon went. I imagined what the fool was carrying in his pocket and the magician in his pouch. The undergarments of the high priestess, the vulva of the empress, and the phallus of the emperor. What the hanged man was hiding in his hands, to whom belonged the decapitated heads of Arcanum X111, and so on. I imagine the thoughts, emotions, sexuality, and actions of each figure. I made them pray, insult, make love, recite poems, and heal. As the word arcanum, major or minor, is not printed on any part of the deck, we should not see the cards as a secret, hidden thing, a thing that is occult and extremely difficult to know. It was up to me to give them a name. Engravings, cards, figures, arcana, victories, the choice was open. As the words épée, sword, coupé, cup, baton, wand, and denier, pinnacle, was already there. I opted for arcana, major and minor, then for an alphabetical order: A for arcana, B for baton, C for coupé, D for denier, E for épée, F for figures. I developed my knowledge of Paul Morteau's tarot for more than 30 years, organized workshops and gave classes, teaching it to hundreds and hundreds of students. In 1993, I received a postcard in which Philippe Camon, direct descendant of the Marseille family that had been printing Nicolas Conver's tarot since 1760, told me about the auto accident in which his father, Denis Camoin, had died. This tragic death had affected him deeply, especially as the municipal authorities had taken advantage of the tragedy to expropriate the property of the printing house, demolish it, and erect a dental school. He could not get past his mourning, and following futile attempts to rejoin society, Philippe Camoin became a hermit. He spent 10 years shut up in his father's house in the small town of Forcalquier, with no other communication with the world except the provided by a satellite antenna that allowed him to receive more than 100 different channels on his television. This was how he was able to learn the basics of a dozen languages. The cathode screen became his interlocutor. He thought he could smell the odor of the people appearing on the screen. When he had a problem or a question, he pressed his remote control at random, and as if by magic, an image, a broadcast, came him a response. One sleepless night, when the clock said 3 o'clock, he asked this question: what should I do to continue the family tradition interrupted by the death of my father? And he pressed a button. I appeared on the screen responding to a journalist. Philippe had the feeling I was addressing him in particular. Several days later, he repeated his question, and I reappeared on the screen. This phenomenon occurred a third time. This was why he decided to return to the world and write me to request a rendezvous. When I saw him arriving, it was impossible to tell his age. He could have been 50 years old or 20. One could have described him as a sage as easily as one could have said a child. He had difficulties expressing himself. Long silences interrupted every word that fell from his mouth. He gave the impression of saying nothing that was personally inspired, as if everything was being dictated to him from a faraway dimension. The transparency of his skin revealed that he was a vegetarian. He had a tattoo at the base of each of his thumbs. There was a moon on the left and a sun on the right. He wanted to attend my tarot classes. The other students wondered if Philippe was mute. he had immense difficulty establishing relations with human beings. It was easier for him to communicate with beings from other worlds. The god, Shiva, moved him because although he was a divine entity, spreading love and fertility, all the demons obeyed him. I decided to undertake a therapeutic initiative using psychomagic. If the death of his father had broken the bonds connecting his son to the world, it would be necessary to reconnect Philippe to the family tradition in order to restore them. To do this, I suggested we together restore the Terre of Marseille. At this time, I was under the impression that this task would simply involve eliminating the small details added by Paul Marteau, and perhaps refining some of the drawings that over time, copy after copy, had eventually been passed down in a confused fashion. Philippe welcomed my proposal enthusiastically. He realized that this was the reason he had sought me out. I spoke with his mother and asked for her help. After the death of her husband, she had donated a considerable collection of tarots to different museums, and she provided us with letters of recommendation. We were always warmly welcomed, and we were allowed to obtain slides of all the cards, useful for our research. Madame Comoin also kept an important collection of printing plates dating from the 18th century. At the end of a year of research, we realized just how immense was the task awaiting us. It was not a question of changing a few details or giving a few lines greater precision. It required the entire restoration of the tarot by giving it back its original colors, painted by hand in the drawings that generations of copyists had erased. Fortunately, while only fragmentary portions survived on some copies, parts that supplied the missing pieces appeared on others, allowing the entire image to be completed. We had to work with powerful computers, thanks to which we're able to compare the countless versions by placing one image on the top of the other. Versions that included those of Nicolas Convert, Dodal, François Turcati, Fautrier, Jean-Paul Payen, Suzanne, Raymondine, Lecourt, and so on. We worked together on this restoration for 2 years. Philippe reconnected with the world and showed evidence of extraordinary skill. He used a computer like an expert. The complexity of the task required more powerful machines. With no worry about expense, his mother provided the technical elements we needed. The difficulty of this restoration work resided in the fact that the Terre of Marseille is made up of symbols that are closely intertwined and connected to one another. If a single line is altered, the entire work is adulterated. A large number of printers of the Terre of Marseille existed during the 17th century. 18th century tarot decks were copies of the earlier ones. We, therefore, cannot accept that any 18th century tarot could be the original. It is extremely likely that Nicolas Convert's version from 1760 contains errors and omissions. While the drawings were hand-painted originally, the number of colors the industrial machines used by 18th century printers could produce was indeed limited. Depending on the printer, the lines and colors were reproduced with varying degrees of fidelity. Those who were not initiates simplified the symbols tremendously. Those copying them added errors to errors. On the other hand, we observed that some tarots had identical and superimposable drawings, and yet each contained symbols that do not appear on the others. We decided that they had been copied from the same tarot, an older version that is now missing. It is this original tarot that we wanted to restore. We had stumbled upon an apparently insurmountable problem. No museum owned a tarot of Marseille that was complete, ancient, and hand-painted. Our work was halted for a time that seemed like an eternity. Suddenly, I remembered that on the Plaza Rio de Janeiro in Mexico City, 60 yards from the house I lived in, lived the antiquarian Raul Campher, a specialist in Aztec and Mayan relics. In 1960, he had tried to sell me an old French tarot painted by hand, for which he wanted $10,000. Obsessed with the weight version at that time, I did not find it interesting, and in any case, it was far too expensive. And then I forgot about it. Miracle! Near to where I once lived was perhaps the valuable example that we so desperately needed. Philippe and I left for Mexico and, gripped by excitement, knocked at the antiquarian's door. A young man answered. It was the son of Raoul Campher, who had died. The young man kept the objects left behind by his father religiously in one room. He did not know if a tarot was hidden among them. He asked us to help him look for it. After a long and extremely anxious time, we finally discovered it in a cardboard box at the bottom of a suitcase. The boy sold it to us for a reasonable price, and we returned to Paris with our prize. This tarot served us as the essential guide for restoring the former colors by computer. As our work advanced, I was going through a series of actual spiritual short circuits. I had spent so many years grafting Paul Marteau's tarot onto my soul, giving every detail the deepest meaning possible, something I could do by placing a boundless love in the arcana. Certain changes affected me like stabs from a knife. Basically, the restoration work demanded that part of me, in the name of change, accept its death by transforming the two dice of Paul Marteau's magician, one showing the number 1 and the other showing the number 5, making 1-5, the number of the devil, and hiding on their opposing faces a 2 and a 6, Yod, 10 plus he, 5 plus vav, 6 plus he, 5, which allowed me to say that the demon was only a mask of God. Into 3 in the restored version, the 3 faces adding up to 7. 3 times 7 equals 21 equals the world. Compelled, the alteration of these symbols into absolutely different ones, which forced me to make exhausting mental efforts to substitute them for the ones I cherished. The same thing happened to me with the emperor's white shoes. I was used to thinking that the powerful monarch took steps of irreproachable purity, as full of wisdom as his white beard. But in reality, the shoes were red, and his beard as blue as the sky. There were the steps of a conquering activity, similar to the cross on the scepter that imposed its mark on the world, and the beard of a man who was sensitive, spiritual, and open, one more intuitive than intellect. In the lover, to my great chagrin, I had to forget the parallel I had drawn between the central figure, whom Marteau depicted barefoot, and Moses, who took off his shoes in order to hear the voice of him on high in the burning bush. It was painful to accept that this figure had red shoes, as active as those of the emperor or the fool, which gave his love a less divine and more earthly appearance. Marteau's hanged man was not suspended by one foot, whereas he was in our version. I had to transfer from a figure who had freely decided not to act to another one who welcomed his bonds like a cosmic law against which he could not rebel, which signified that freedom was, for him, obedience to this law. In Marteau's Arcanum X111, The skeleton is cutting off his foot, self-destruction. In ours, he has a blue foot as well as one arm and a spinal column of the same color, a constructive action repeated in his scythe, wherein where the old red was blended with this heavenly blue, signifying a seeding of the spirit. Marteau's devil brandishes a sword by the blade, stupidly wounding his hand, whereas in ours, this hand is holding a torch, casting light in the darkness. In the tower, 3 initiatory steps and a door appear, which implies that the 2 figures are not falling but have left joyfully and of their own free will, and so many other details that changed my vision. Of course, I needed time to abandon Marteau. I began by mixing the 2 decks, which I presented all together to the consultant. Gradually, the old deck appeared to wither like autumn leaves, while the new one seemed to acquire a more intense energy each day. One Wednesday morning in the garden of my home in Vincennes, I buried my beloved Paul Marteau Tarot at the foot of a bushy lime tree with the sorrow of a son burying his mother, and planted a rose bush on top of it. That very evening at the Café Saint-Fiacre, where I gave my free tarot readings once a week, I used for the first time and forever after the restored tarot. This first time coincided with Marianne Costa coming to my table. My meeting with her was just as important as that with Philippe Camoin. Without Marianne, I could have never had written this book, even if it is difficult for the rational mind to accept that nothing is accidental in nature, that everything that happens in the universe is caused by a pre-established law, that certain events are written in the future, and that the effect precedes the cause. The appearance of my collaborator seemed like the work of a destiny established by an inconceivable being. Marianne was my first student, then my assistant, and we ended up reading the tarot together, therefore fulfilling what was indicated by the arcana: the emperor, empress, the high priestess, pope, the moon, the sun. The initiate needs his female complement and vice versa, for both to attain a reading guided by cosmic consciousness. Alejandro Jodorowsky.